I also really am fascinated about the ways in which you've articulated privilege, and was wondering if you could break that down a little bit and talk about how privilege also operates it as this form of a psychological protection mechanism.
Yeah. So the common idea that we use, within social justice circles is that privilege is inequity or and material inequity, right? That's the
Right.
general idea. You have access to resources, or you don't have X experiences because of X. And that kind of like works well or okay, I feel like. I know this is going to sound really critical. I'm just going to like caveat that, but it works
Sure.
really well. Okay, so I'm actually going to backtrack and this is going to find my assignment. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, because it's like the edgy stuff, right? Because there's a lot of like where the language of privilege comes from.
Mhm.
I think it's that essay by Peggy McIntosh. I think that was the person. Who's a white woman who's trying to understand what Black women go through.
Mhm. Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack.
Yeah,
That one,
exactly.
the
Yeah,
Peggy
yeah, yeah,
McIntosh.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think so, right?
Hmm.
So, and when you actually look at the map of that, it's still like a person with power and an institution trying to understand non-institution, like people's lives that are not advantaged by the institution.
Hmm.
The way the communication is going, right? And so it's
Right.
the way I try to say it's still like people being explained to institutions.
Hmm.
So privilege to me, I think makes a lot of sense. Let's say when you're looking at things like demographic data, or like infant deaths. Like you see that Black women, like infant mortality is like just a much higher has a much higher case ratio, right?
Right.
And so I think when you're looking at those kind of numbers and numerical things that are really easily gathered by institutions, privilege is a great thing to understand because it's like the language of the institution.
Hmm.
But I think it has huge limitations when you're talking people to people.
Sure.
And that's like kind of my critique of, generally speaking, of the last um, kind of years of social justice work. And it's not that like none of that's valuable. I'm not saying scrap it or anything like that, but I mean I think we're in like a place where we're reevaluating these things and updating the language and ideas as we need to, for the times we're in, right? And of course this is an edgy topic because I think a lot of people um I think for a lot of people ideas like privilege and
Hmm.
have become part of the language set and they hold on to it as a certain thing and it's stabilized their
Sure.
life, right? But when I speak about privilege, it's a lot more of a psychological mechanism.
Hmm.
And when I say that cultures are bodies, that means that these bodies experience dissociation, right? And this embodied dissociation in this cultural body, this cultural larger collective,
Hmm.
shows up as privilege between people. So what I mean by that is that let's say people who are we can mark as having privilege, let's say like let's just take the apex, like middle to upper class white cis straight males, right? What they're experiencing is not so much actually this material inequality, right? This is an interesting part.
Yeah.
What they're really experiencing is this dissociation from what's really happening in the world. So the privilege, the inequality is there to protect these bodies from processing pain,
Mm.
processing information. So
Right.
it's protecting certain parts of the body. So when you have your own body, right? Let's say it's in a traumatic response, your brain, right? Because your brain and your gut can operate separately, right? So it's like a case where your brain is dissociated and not able to track what the rest of the body is doing, but your gut is, let's say, corroding, and then there's toxins leaking through the lining. It's creating tumors.
Sure.
Maybe it's creating diabetes. Maybe it's creating all these chronic ailments, chronic fatigue, and it shows up. The first signs are like joint pain and stuff like that, right?
Hmm.
Autoimmune stuff like that shows up that way. But the mind is still dissociated from the emotional experience that are creating this condition in the stomach, right? And so, in a very similar way, you have this society where people who have this quote unquote privilege are kind of like stuck in this place of being dissociated from what's happening in the rest of the body. They're out of touch. That doesn't mean the rest of the body's out of touch. Because just like how our
Mm.
gut is like, oh, my gut, the gut knows itself is sick.
It knows. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it knows it's sick, right?
Yeah.
And it all the signs of the body shows up in it.
Hmm.
So privilege is really this dissociation mechanism, because otherwise it's, I wouldn't, I think to say it's harmless is kind of a weird way to put it, but it really wouldn't mean that much.
Mm,
Like it would dissolve. People give it up and they'll be like, yep, okay. Like it's, and there wouldn't be that much emotional energy protecting it if it wasn't for the dissociative mechanism that's behind it,
gotcha,
right?
gotcha. Yep.
And so that's like kind of like the thing we look at. And so the energy imbalance, of course, is this resource imbalance, right?
Mhm.
Because resources are energy, and underneath these resource imbalances or energy imbalances is some kind of trauma, right? And this is like that cultural trauma that we're talking about.
Right.
So in the case of things like white supremacy, it's like kind of like the Resmaa Menakem, if you know him, who's another cultural somatic practitioner,
Hmm.
Black therapist. Um, I forgot where he's based out of, but he wrote a book called My Grandmother's Hands, and
Mm,
we have a very similar analysis. But the primary pain of white people, for example, would be the pain of the imperialization of Europe, which happened like hundreds of years ago before there's any kind of European colonialism anywhere else. There was internal, like the Roman Empire went berserk basically, and there's all these other empires, right? Everywhere in the
yeah.
world does, but like, so the primary pain of white supremacy, like is born out of these like ancestral pains in Europe, right?
Hmm.
And so it's kind of like the thesis then is that if you're able to deal with those ancestral pains in a good way,
Hmm.
in particular, and it has to be in a way that like regrounds the body and tones the nervous system, then things like privilege that are material will shift.